Good morning, everyone, and welcome to LIBN Now Experts Forum, delivering Long Island's business community the most relevant information on topics that are affecting your business. I'm Jenna Natali, Associate Publisher at Long Island Business News. Today's topic has been the cause of anxiety and heartbreak for an increasing number of families, employers, and professionals, and that's addiction. It's no surprise that the financial and the psychological impacts of COVID-19, particularly the lockdown phase, has resulted in an uptick in mental health struggles. For many, that's resulted in fierce addiction battles. From alcohol to illicit drug use, the National Safety Council reports that 1 in 12 employees deal with an untreated substance abuse disorder. The human, legal, and workplace impacts are vast. And many times, an employer struggles to find the answers on how they can help their staff while still protecting their business. Luckily, thanks to our co-presenting sponsors at Wellbridge Addiction Treatment and Research and Ruskin Moscow Faltashek, they've helped us pull together an expert panel that can help employers of every shape and size navigate this vital issue. And LIBN thanks them for helping us present this very vital conversation. As a friendly reminder to our live guests, Zoom attendees are welcome to submit their questions at any time by clicking Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom control bar. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible. With that, please welcome today's expert panel. Dr. Christopher Yadrin, Chief Executive Officer at Wellbridge Addiction Treatment and Research. Kimberly Malerba, Partner at Ruskin Moscow Faltashek. And Aoife O'Donnell, CEO of National EAP. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. Moderating today's conversation, please welcome LIBN's editor and my fellow associate publisher, Joe Dowd. Take it away, everybody.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you to our guests. And welcome to LIBN Now Experts Forum. I want to begin by posing this question. It's the 21st century, and there still remains the image of an alcoholic who staggers on the street corner with a drug addict who shoots up in an alleyway. It's so much more than that, isn't it? What's worse is that many companies and their leaders do not understand the nature of alcoholism and drug addiction and how it can be impacting their workforce in profound ways that they just hadn't realized. What's central to our discussion today is that addiction has gotten worse since the pandemic, when perhaps for the first time, many people face their own mortality. That has led to more people with drug and alcohol problems flying under the radar and without getting the support they need and may even want. We have an expert panel today. We want to thank you again for joining us. Let me throw this question first to Chris. Chris, how bad is the problem? What needs to be done? Can you define the scope?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a big question, Joe. It's a big problem. About 20 million Americans struggle with or suffer from a substance use disorder. So that's one way of thinking about the problem. About 4% of Americans in the past year would meet the criteria for a substance use disorder, and over 10% if we're going to look at lifetime prevalence. So it's pretty big in that regard. And then if you look at the way that the pandemic has really exacerbated people and their lives and the stressors that we face economically, socially, access to resources, there's so many ways that it's impacted people. So you see overdose rates really skyrocketing, actually the highest they've ever been in the past year. Many, many Americans struggling with this issue. So from a humanistic and from just the impact on people's lives has been really big. And then in the context of business, it hurts organizations. So many businesses that are contributing in different ways to our social good are impacted as well in terms of their ability to function. So I could go on. It's a great question. It's a big question, but it's a pretty profound problem.
Well, I'm going to pose rather the question to everyone. Okay, Aoife, can you define the problem from your perspective?
Well, it's a silent killer, really. People were concerned when COVID started that the suicide rate would increase, but data was showing at the time that that actually wasn't happening. But what was happening was the overdose rate was escalating, and binge drinking and all of that. So it's really it's people's inability to cope with their current reality. There's so many complex issues, right? But it's seeking relief from a substance, and then the original seeking relief may turn into abuse, right? And then it turns into dependence. People who have addiction, they're struggling, and there are so many resources out there to get help, but there's so much shame that blocks the way, and there's so much stigma. And so from an EAP perspective, an employee assistance program perspective, we're always working with our clients to say, let's name the problem, let's put it out there, and let's encourage our members and your employees to get the help they need, right? So from a workplace perspective, it is a huge issue, because people, especially with working remote, it's easier to drink at 1 o'clock and hide it. No one's smelling you, right? No one's smelling your breath. It's quick Zoom calls, so maybe you can hide the fact that you're slurring and your gait is impaired. So when you're in person, we teach managers and leaders how to spot the signs and symptoms. And it's important not to assume that there is a substance abuse problem, but that when you see the signs and symptoms, as an impairment in performance, right? So it's definitely complicated. It's huge for employers when they're not prepared. And I'm sure Kim can talk to this. When they're not prepared with policy, they don't know what to do. And in fact, their hands are tied a little bit, right? But our goal is always, let's remove the stigma and shame, and let's talk about it, and let's encourage people to get the help, because they're not addicts. It's people who are struggling with an addiction issue or a substance abuse issue, but it doesn't define their totality. It's not who they are. So we need to be mindful of language as well. But Kim, I'm going to kick that over to you to
Please,
take.
Kim.
Yeah, I mean, so much of what Aoife just referred to resonates with me, because with regard to substance use issues and alcoholism, there's so many impacts on employers, absenteeism, lateness, potential safety issues, overall profitability suffers. And so there's so many reasons for employers to be aware of these issues and to try to help, because a lot of our clients are still struggling to staff their businesses right now. It's hard to get enough employees to do the work and to retain those employees, because it's a strange job market right now. And so addressing these issues is of critical importance to maintaining especially good workers, because, as Aoife said, these are not addicts. These are people that have struggles. And so you want to try to help people to the extent that you can, but it's also really important to set yourself up as an employer to be able to deal with it. And probably the first piece of this involves having proper policies in place, because Aoife took the expression I always say, you tie your hands if you don't have the proper policies in place. And you want to present employees with the option of being able to come forward, because if they have a concern, and sometimes individuals are not willing to acknowledge that they do have an issue for whatever reason, whether it is a stigma or they don't recognize it. But some companies will say, if you come forward, there are obligations by the company to help people. But if you don't come forward and then there's a workplace problem, whether it's a safety issue or some other infraction, they don't have the same obligations. An employer doesn't have the same obligations to help, because now there's a performance problem that they can deal with differently.
Well, Kim,
Counsel employees on that issue, because they may call us and we may recognize that there is an issue, and that's why they're having workplace challenges, and their supervisors all over them, and they're being written up. And we're like, the opportunity in speaking up about what's going on is XYZ, right? So you get to actually keep your job. There's job protections in place. If you seek help, get treatment, and the employer works with you. To not do that creates consequences.
Okay, well, it's complicated though, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is more complicated than the flu, let's say.
Way more.
Certainly.
Isn't it more complicated? And this is where lots of people go underground, because let's talk about the two. There are kind of like two issues here. One, the employer wants to help someone who has one of these, has an addiction issue, and an issue with substances, alcohol, whatever. On the other hand, they have no real obligation, do they, to, under the law, to act if someone comes to work drunk. They can fire them if you have a no drinking policy on the job or no drug use on the job rule in place. So Kim, let's address the legal side first from an employer's point of view. What are your obligations?
So that's a really important distinction. The law does not protect employees who violate workplace drug and alcohol policies. And so that means if somebody is currently using illegal drugs or comes to work under the influence of alcohol, that is not protected and an employer can terminate on that basis. However, someone who suffers from alcoholism or a substance use disorder who's not currently using, those people are protected under a variety of laws. And so they have protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act and under state and sometimes local law, where an employer, if somebody suffers from addiction or is undergoing treatment for a substance use disorder, they must provide accommodations if that kind of accommodation would allow someone to perform the essential functions of their job. So that sometimes means they need to take leave. They have to take some time to go to a counseling center, to go to rehab. They may need a different schedule. You might have to alter the hours so that they can leave and go to counseling or treatment. But there's a whole host of things that may be open, and it may include going, getting treatment through an EAP, there's so many options available once this interactive discussion takes place, but that is only for somebody in terms of requirements who is not currently using illegal drugs or who is not coming to work impaired, because the law never protects somebody who is currently using illegal drugs. But that's not to say someone can't help. You can help, but you don't have to. So it is important for employers to understand where the obligation is as compared with where there's an option to help. And certainly where there's somebody who's a good employee who you want to help, there's nothing barring you from doing that, even if they're currently using illegal drugs.
Okay, well, this raises a big question. Okay. And let's come back to the flu. And I want Chris to address this, please, and go through some of the human aspects of this disease. Okay. The law isn't really very good because it does something that it never does with everybody else. If I come to work with the flu and collapse, or I'm so impaired with the flu that I can't really work, you are absolutely obligated to take care of your worker, aren't you? But the question of whether or not alcoholism and drug addiction is a disease has been the question probably since the beginning of the middle of the 20th century. Chris, is it a disease or isn't it? Could you address that, please?
Yeah, well, aside from my viewpoint, if you ask the American Medical Association, there's very clear description and definition of substance use disorder as a disease in a progressive chronic fashion in terms of the impact upon the brain, but also the impact upon the psychosocial functioning of individuals as well. So Aoife brought up some really great points, actually Aoife and Kim both, relative to stigma, language. The way we describe things alters the ways that we think about things and the way that we approach individuals. And so really humanizing this, thinking about it as an illness is really important. No one wishes or welcomes substance use disorders or problems with addiction into their lives. It's one of the most destructive and stigmatized illnesses that anyone faces, right? So no one welcomes this. At the core of it, in terms of the impact upon the brain, is a loss of control. I try to cut down, I'm unable, I try to stop, and I continue to return to use. And so it's really important to operate with compassion and extend kindness to individuals. And I really appreciated Kim's points about, if someone is exhibiting the behavior of using an illegal substance or coming to work impaired or intoxicated, the employer isn't obligated, but they still have the opportunity to help that employee. And I think that's, it's wise fiscally. I mean, in terms of the ways that we invest in our employees for training, orientation, recruitment, even if we just want to look at it from that point of view, but it's wise from a humanistic and a personal level. recognizing that these are not issues that people welcome and invite into their lives. They find themselves in a very difficult place without the ability to stop, without additional help. And that's where treatment, like at Wellbridge or many other great providers locally and abroad and regionally, are able to intervene. And there are medical interventions, pharmacological interventions that can be really helpful in terms of medications. And then psychological and social interventions, behavioral interventions that really can help people build skills, insight, and what they need to engage with a long-term recovery plan.
Now, Chris, one size does not fit all, correct? In these, when we address these problems, can you address how you see different, like a range of problems and a range of solutions?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think for years, addiction treatment was outside of mainstream medical care. That's starting to change. And for a long time, there was a one size fits all approach. You go away for 28 days of rehab and then go home and try to make that work. But that's not really a very wise approach when you think about the uniqueness of individuals, different situations that people have, and the need to tailor treatment. If you had any other medical condition, I have a family member who's a cancer survivor, for example. We wouldn't expect that every person who presents with cancer receives the exact same course of treatment. That would be ludicrous. The same thing is true for this illness. There's a course of severity from mild to moderate and more severe aspects of the condition. People have different resources. Individuals have sometimes very supportive support systems or family systems. Other times they're quite isolated and alone. That requires a different set of interventions. Some individuals have particular substance use disorders that are more treatable with the use of medications than others. So it's really important to personalize care in terms of the level of care. Wellbridge offers detoxification and rehab, which are residential and very intensive levels of care. But it's important that sometimes individuals receive outpatient care and that we tailor the treatment and the solution to the more specific and personal nature of the way they're experiencing the illness.
Mm-hmm. Aoife, one size doesn't fit all, does it? What's your experience?
It certainly doesn't. And the population we're not talking about today as well is the parents of young adults or teenagers who are abusing a substance, and they're desperate as employees to know what to do and how to care for their family as well, right? So that's probably an even larger employee population that leaders are dealing with as concerned parents. Yeah, one size does not fit all. For some people, they can be quite successful in an outpatient program right away, and they don't need to even go to detox or to a rehab, inpatient rehab facility. It really depends on what their level of abuse is, what their substance is, what their support structure is. For others, it's so critical to get out of the environment, to break the patterns, break the habits, spend time away. It might be the first time they've ever had alone time to really confront and face their challenge.
Okay.
So one size does not fit all. There are treatment facilities, all over the country. They are not all the same. It's really important that our employees are supported in where they're going, that they get guidance from inside the industry, whether it's your EAP or an advocate perhaps, or your doctor, as to what facilities are great, just like Wellbridge. It's really, really critical because it can make or break someone's success. There's groups for professionals, there's groups for the medical world, there's groups for, all kinds of industries where people can go and really feel like they're in a peer community.
To pick up on just something that Aoife just mentioned also about the parents and about, because that is sometimes a big issue. If somebody has a serious health condition, such as, substance use disorder or alcoholism, they may be entitled, depending on the size of the company, themselves for family medical leave. And so if a close family member, like someone's child, is suffering and needs treatment and the parent needs time off, if they're in a company that's subject to Family Medical Leave Act, then that person as well may be entitled to take unpaid time away from work, which is job protected. It's not paid, but it's job protected, to assist that family member to get the help that they need. So that's something that at least some people might be able to assist in a better way to have their child, let's say, attend maybe a rehab program, or even if it's intermittent leave.
Okay, let's come back to the idea of treatment, okay? An employee comes to an employer, a boss, and says, I got a problem, boss. I've been drinking too much. Let's keep it that simple. They come to you and they say, I have a problem and I've had this problem for a while and I don't know how to kick it. Can you help me? If you have a policy in place and if you are forward thinking, this is something that a company wants to do, because many employees you get them well, they become very productive. Chris, what should someone expect if they go to treatment at Wellbridge? What would it be that they should expect on the first day, the first week? What kind of inpatient would that look like?
Sure. Well, like we've been discussing, and I think there were some other comments about personalized care, or there's not a one size fits all approach. I would expect the individual, and certainly if they come to Wellbridge, to have an individualized treatment plan, right? So I think we can speak in generalities. They should be treated with dignity and respect. They should be offered kindness and compassion, and they should be treated with highly competent care from licensed professionals. So as part of our team here, we have physicians, nurse practitioners, physician assistants, psychologists, psychiatrists, licensed clinical social workers. We have peer support specialists, individuals who are approaching it from a place of lived experience to provide additional support as part of the experience. Fundamental to the treatment experience is an assessment that determines what are the unique and particular needs of this individual and family, what's the appropriate level of care, and what interventions might need to be prioritized. And then secondly, a treatment plan that outlines some of the goals and objectives of where we're headed and the interventions that we need to achieve those goals. And then the third piece, just to answer your question specifically, Joe, is a discharge plan. What do I do after this, right? It's not a problem that is simply an acute issue that arises and then goes away easily overnight. We need to think about next steps, additional supports. Who are the supportive individuals, whether it's someone from the EAP or in the workplace or medical care, outpatient services on the outside of an inpatient stay. But what's next for this person? How do we help them become and see themselves successfully navigating this illness into sustained recovery for years beyond? And so that oftentimes involves a very detailed plan in terms of what's next. I could go more in terms of the particulars of the experience, but it's a day's usually comprised of group therapy, individual therapy. In a place like Wellbridge, there are also other supportive ways in which individuals begin to re-engage with themselves and their lives. Family sessions, the use of art and music. We have an extensive fitness and wellness center, yoga, just a whole variety of things for people to connect physically, mentally, spiritually with themselves in a way that's productive.
Okay, Aoife?
Joe, yeah, I loved your question, because it's like, the employee comes forward and says, I'm drinking too much. I'm desperate. This is why I've been showing up late. What do I do? And the bridge between a program like Wellbridge and the manager is often a great EAP. And I cannot advocate that enough. I can't say that enough, that, if you're an employer that doesn't have an EAP, please get yourself a great EAP, a top tier EAP, because the bridge becomes where the manager often then will tell HR contacts national EAP, and we become the bridge and the support and the guide, helping the employer and the employee through the next steps. And often legal too, because someone might call Kim and say, okay, legally, what am I obligated to do? And what is it I want to do? What should I do? And Kim helps assess liability, but we're the people who say, okay, HR does not have to become a therapist, please don't. A manager does not have to become a therapist, please don't. And instead, hand them over sometimes a suggested referral, an administrative referral to National EP to say, this is what the employee is reporting. This is what we expect. This is what we need. We will do an initial assessment. We will then refer them to a place like Wellbridge or others that we feel would be an appropriate match for their level of need. And then Wellbridge would take them into their system. And as Chris indicated, work with the EAP, who then communicates to the employer with consent, of course, everything's HIPAA compliant, that the employee is attending and complying and making progress with their treatment plan. Because we have a known abuse issue in the workplace, it's documented, so we can communicate about it. So the treatment facility, the EAP, and the employer all work together to create successful outcomes for the employee.
For a lot of people, though, and you just raised a great point, okay? They have to comply. Is that
Yes.
correct? Okay, and
Yes.
Kim, you would agree they have to comply with the treatment program, right?
Yeah, and I think, what Eva said is really important. Like, the HR person shouldn't be the person doing the counseling, or, and part of that goes to training, right? That the supervisors, the leadership in an organization needs to know, well, what happens if someone comes to me with this issue? Because there's actually a multifaceted, there are many issues raised by that. Because one, the way you phrased it, this person has said, I'm having a problem with alcohol. They're not necessarily coming to work drunk, right? So,
Absolutely, no.
so they may be suffering from alcoholism, which is a protected disability. So now they are in a protected class, and the employer cannot take action, discriminatory action against that person for being an alcoholic, for suffering from alcoholism. And so it's important to make sure that there is no discrimination, there's no retaliation, and that person in that role, that supervisor, that manager knows, okay, I need to now link up with HR, who knows to contact now the EAP. Because far too many times, and it happens with different issues, if supervisors are not properly informed about how to handle employee issues, whether it's complaints of different varieties or things like this, they may not know to report it up. And now, from a legal perspective, if this person is, is a supervisor level person, there's an obligation on the employer to act appropriately and to ensure that there is no discrimination. And also, if they've acknowledged an alcohol problem, depending on the industry and depending on the company's policies and whether this is like a safety sensitive position, you may now have knowledge that there could be an issue. Maybe this person is at times coming to work, under the influence. And what if they operate a forklift or they drive a company vehicle and somebody gets hurt? Negligence is know or should have known. Perhaps the company should have known that this presented a safety risk, and God forbid somebody gets seriously hurt or dies as a result of what happened. There's so many different issues that come from this. And the key to all of this is proper training, because if people are properly trained to go to HR, who then knows who to contact, like Aoife, or someone in her setting, then you can handle all these issues properly and orderly.
Okay, well, the place that this comes up most of the time is with middle managers, okay? Because it's almost never they go right to HR. A lot of times what happens is a middle manager like myself suspects that something is amiss, and all of a sudden a performance problem has occurred that hadn't been a factor earlier. What's an employer to do at that point? Now, I recognize, same thing. It is very important, isn't it, Kim? And please, everybody jump in, all right? It's very important to recognize that as a manager, you can't accuse someone of drinking too much. Unless you can, I guess, unless you smell it on their breath, but I don't even know if that's possible. The issue becomes, if you suspect it, what are your obligations in the workplace, and what do you need to do? Kim, I'm going to let you kick that off, and then I'll let everybody else go ahead.
Sure. So, the first step, in my opinion, generally with any of these types of issues, is to focus on the performance issue. Unless this is the exception, would be if there's a real safety issue. If you have someone, again, operating a forklift and you smell a strong scent of alcohol on their breath, that's different, because now you have a real safety issue and you have to address that immediately to avoid any sort of imminent danger. But if you have, more of a standard office job type of scenario, then my approach would be focus on the performance issue. You've been coming in late, your work's been sloppy, you haven't attended meetings, your attendance has been poor, whatever the objective signs are, and speak to that person about those issues like you would any other person. And that opens the door for the person to say, well, I'm having an issue with whatever it is, whether it be a mental health concern that is, it may not even be, you may think it's alcohol or drugs, it may not be, they may have some other health issue, they may be undergoing cancer treatment and they're undergoing chemo, you don't know about it, and they're tired in the morning and it's causing them to have a cloudy brain, you don't know what the reason is. So if you focus on the objective symptoms, if you will, the lateness, the sloppiness, inattentiveness at work, whatever it is, you give them the opportunity to disclose the issue. It's up to them if they want to tell you. If they don't want to tell you and they don't disclose any sort of protected issue, a disability, a substance issue, whatever it is, then my advice is you treat them as any other person who's having these types of performance issues. And that may mean discipline, corrective action plan, performance improvement plan, however you would otherwise deal with performance issues. And that's up to them. And if they can't come through on the performance issues, you have the right to terminate. And there's nothing more that you need to do from that perspective. But if you open the door and they disclose, you know what, you're right, I am having an issue. I'm having an issue with alcohol. I'm having a different substance issue. Maybe it's a prescription medicine issue, even something that's lawfully prescribed. And even if you're taking it in accordance with the prescription, if you're on Xanax, it might make you tired. It might, or any number of any other protected, controlled substance. It could have other impacts on your work. So once that's open, then you have the opportunity. Is an EAP appropriate? Is an accommodation necessary? And you open the door to that. But I would never broach that until and unless the employee opens the door, unless, like I said, there's some sort of dangerous situation that needs immediate attention.
Okay.
Joe, there's so many scenarios flying through my head just from the past year, even of.
Let's go through a couple of those.
Well,
Let's
it's so
do some
typical.
examples.
Well, it's typical that an employer suspects it's alcohol or substance abuse, but there isn't concrete, tangible evidence to say that out loud. But there is performance decline, and there's rumor of a divorce, and there's rumor that they saw them drunk on a street, and there's all this back end information. So HR sits there kind of going, okay, what's official? What's not official? And we coach, often saying you don't make assumptions, right? Deal in the facts. What are the facts in front of you? Just like Kim said. So we document based on facts. We have conversation based on facts. So recently, an HR team met with a huge important salesperson that showed signs in like 4 different Zoom calls of slurring of words, nodding off, etc. And so they were like, is there something we need to know? Because this is how you're presenting, right? And they're challenging him on the signs, the symptoms, etc. He did acknowledge there is something going on. And they said, well, thank you for being honest. And let's get you the help you need because this can't continue. So what's your pathway to help, right? So it's an interactive dialogue and then link them to taking the action they need. They had decided in advance, of course, that they wanted to support this employee to a path of wellness. It's just often the workplace becomes the rock bottom, becomes the place that's the mirror that says, you've been cheating, you've been hiding this thing. You think you have it under control. You do not. Here's the consequence if you don't fix your problems. Here's the consequence if you don't confront your behaviors and your medical issue. And I have to say, in so many more instances than not, the workplace can be such a positive intervention and becomes the place where people really turn around their lives because they're going to lose this, 6-figure job and their livelihood for their family. And they thought they were getting away with it, but they're not. And it's usually that first big wake up call, right? So I obviously am an advocate for employers being proactive, saying it when they see the problem. Too often managers will sweep it under the rug. And as Kim indicated, there's huge liability with that. So, we do need to talk to our managers and train them on, they are representatives of the organization or the union or the workplace or the medical establishment. And if you see something, know something, you have to say it. You have to let the right people handle it.
Chris, I want you to address something that's important with this also. When one, as a middle manager, as a top manager, addresses one of these questions, a lot of times what's going to happen, and I mean saying your performance is suffering. Is it not true that a lot of alcoholics and drug addicts are going to lie about this?
Well, even the way that you frame that, Joe, right, is I think indicative of how people feel about this issue, right? That individuals, to Aoife's point earlier, they become conflated with the illness. Being thought of as an addict versus a person suffering with addiction, individuals who are thought to be problems, thieves, liars, all of these, moral judgments, right? So, I think it's easy for us to somehow put that or place that upon the person and say, this person is going to be less than forthcoming about the situation. But there's tremendous pressure on people to hide this on the basis of stigma, shame, fear about repercussions, a lack of awareness where, what are the resources that exist for this? What are the limits of the law? How is my employer going to respond? I think about, creating a climate where people could come forward and imagine being cared for or responded to in a way similar to if they came, we brought up cancer a couple of times. If I went to my board of directors, as CEO, I'm accountable to a board. If I went to the board and said, I have cancer or my wife has cancer, I'm going to do everything I can in my role, but I need some space. I need some time. I need some help. Relative to the impact on my job. I believe I would be met with a lot of support, understanding, and the willingness to work out a plan of what I need or my family needs to get through that. I don't think people in general, the general population, really believe that they'll receive the same kind of response if they come forward and say, not my son has cancer, but my son is dealing with an addiction. And I'm struggling to perform at work because of that. Or I myself am. And I'm just, even though I'm living paycheck to paycheck right now, I'm just going to trust that you're going to act ethically and compassionately in response to this concern. So I think it's important that we do a number of things, right? We change the language in terms of how we refer to individuals who are struggling with these illnesses and concerns. We proactively educate within the workplace in terms of what are the resources available toward wellness for a variety of conditions and needs, but including substance use disorders and mental health needs. And we build a culture in which we're supporting our workforce and letting people know that resources are available and hope is possible. So I don't know. I got going there, Joe. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Actually, you did answer the question. Just one follow-up. One of the consequences to an addict or an alcoholic of going to a program like Wellbridge is that he or she is going to lose his drug or booze of choice forever. How do you address that at Wellbridge?
Yeah, that's a big issue for people, right? It's become a way of coping with very difficult emotions. It's become a source of physiological dependence. My body needs this to feel okay, to feel normal. Imagine if you woke up every day feeling completely out of sorts with your body, with your emotions, with your relationships, and there is something you can take or use to change that experience, then there's a very powerful relationship between those things. And so through the various supports and interventions that we have, again, using medication, using counseling and therapy, giving individuals the time to work through things that they need to do, we provide the resources available for people to make that transition and begin to build insight around how can I survive without the substance, give them time to begin to feel physically different without the substance, and also try to help them begin to build skills of how do I live my life, or how do I cope with various challenges without using this substance. And so those are all much more compassionate and competent ways to help individuals, and know that it's a process. We really too, years ago, there was in the treatment field, and I mean years ago, like decades ago, especially, it was if you don't, kind of a scare you straight kind of approach. We're at Wellbridge, we're using evidence-based interventions like motivational interviewing to explore individuals' internal mechanisms for change. What are their values? What is it that they want and desire to create? And then how do we align with that person's internal motivation for change in order to bring that about and shift away from the dependence on substances to a life of recovery? And quite honestly, you see a dramatic change in people who walk in here on their first day looking very frail, very ill, to the day that they leave if they complete treatment here, let alone 6 months and a year into that process of living a life of recovery. So there's real tragedy around this, but there's incredible optimism and opportunity for change. And when people find recovery, it's a truly before and after experience in their lives.
And Chris, I just want to stay with that for a second. So what you're saying is this is not your father's rehab. It's kind of an important point. This is a different kind of rehab and a different kind of follow-up process than what's happened in the last, say, 2 or 3 decades, where largely there was an AA approach to aftercare. And I think that's worth addressing. Chris?
Yeah, most fellowships like AA or NA are very, very, oftentimes very supportive and necessary for individuals to find a community and connections where they can have social support and continue to grow post-treatment. There are still some treatment centers today, however, or earlier forms of treatment where it was, well, if you don't hit rock bottom, I guess get back out there, and then when you're ready, then we'll work with you. Or if you don't change, you're going to die, or you're going to lose all of these things, and just a lot of fear and ways that might temporarily motivate someone, but it doesn't lead to lasting change. It's not evidence-based. It's not an effective and compassionate way to help individuals. So by using the best medications that we have available today, by using evidence-based psychosocial therapies, those are the best ways to engage individuals. And I mentioned motivational interviewing. It's a very different way of engaging people around what they truly want in terms of the positive things in their lives. People are dependent upon and using substances to their detriment and harm. I guess at a certain point, it feels like survival when they enter. But what people generally want is to find a way out and reconnect with themselves and their families and do meaningful work and find meaningful relationships. I mean, nobody comes to Wellbridge or any other place like this, like a vacation. I mean, it is one of the lowest and worst points of someone's lives. And they may not also see yet, they're here, but they may not see yet, what does this look like without alcohol? Or what does this look like without my drug or drugs of choice? Our job is to help them take those steps and begin to envision what that could be and begin to experience life without that substance in a way that's powerful and personal for them.
Aoife,
can you also address that, please, in general?
Yeah. And I something I was thinking while Chris was speaking is the importance of, and I think, Kim, you would agree, workplaces. I mean, we keep saying the workplace needs to do so much more, right? And it's so hard to do everything. Harassment training is now mandated annually in New York. You got to do it. But boy, I wish this would be too, because maybe even just well-being education, that's done once a year, some kind of program, because addiction, people, in that level, right, that phase, there's phases before that, high risk drinking, right, or risky drinking. And that's a more significant part of your employee population, where people are able to walk the line, keep it together, but they are now drinking at too high a rate or abusing a substance where, abuse will turn into dependence if they're not careful, right? So what education mechanism is in place to stop that percentage of the population becoming a huge nightmare, right? Or having this, massive medical issue. So workplaces are such and it's not hard to launch a program, a well-being program. I mean, you know, we're working with the union right now that for all of their first year apprentices in their program, we're doing well-being checks. So we're on site, we're doing one-to-one 15-minute connections for their EAP. And we're doing brief screenings of, you know, how's your health level, what's going on, et cetera. But we're also educating them on the fact that EAP exists. Here's what we can help you with. And really laying that groundwork, making that connection one-to-one in person, so that if there is an abuse or dependence issue going on or other mental health challenges, they will self-motivate to get the help they need. That's a program large companies do often, but the union's doing it because they don't want to keep having to send people off to treatment. It's an intervention, it's a preventative strategy, and it's a smart one. And it's one that's going to pay off. So you could have, you know, one-to-one well check programs. You can have education regarding recognizing stress and burnout. You can do management education regarding substance abuse in the workplace, signs and symptoms, what to do, how to handle it. You know, and you can promote all of your services, all of your well-being services, you know, and I think that that's so important. We're talking about how do you intervene, but also prevention and education is critical.
Kim, I would really like you to give the employer, the boss, the middle manager, a good, concise overview of their legal obligations and what they absolutely have to know. What are your recommendations on that?
Sure. Well, I guess just to start with what Aoife said, I mean, training is key. Having programs, as you were just describing, would be terrific. I think realistically, what happens is employers tend to be more reactive rather than proactive. And once something happens, you know, heaven forbid, but something catastrophic, then these types of programs sometimes then come into play because, as you said, in New York in particular, employers have so many obligations that it's very difficult to keep up with everything, you know, like you mentioned, the sexual harassment training, you know, all the different policies, procedures, programs that they have to provide to employees becomes overwhelming for a lot of employers. And so even though the proactive approach, you know, it's like the ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? I think the more that this type of information gets out there to employers, that perhaps you will see an uptick in people proactively seeking to encourage more wellness programs, because ultimately it saves them money, right? It helps insurance premiums, it helps save money in employee absenteeism, productivity, all of those things. It's critically important. And so to that point, and part of what you said too, goes to the training of your middle managers, of your supervisors, and even of your top leadership, because a lot of people don't know what to do when they're presented with these types of issues. And so making sure, again, starting with a policy, have a policy in place, depending on what kind of opportunity the company is going to present to the employees, put that into your policies, get it out to employees so they know. If you're going to have a relationship with an EAP or other wellness providers, make sure people know how to take advantage of those benefits, because I think a lot of times employers mean well and they want to do these things, but they don't necessarily think to the next step. Just having the policy is not enough. Employees need to know about it and they need to know how to take advantage. And if they have an understanding, the way Chris was just describing, of the hopeful nature of the fact that things can be better for you, right? You don't have to suffer alone in silence. And so much of what we're talking about with substance use and alcoholism, it's tied to other mental health concerns. And, you know, that is so prevalent. I think everyone either suffers from or knows people close to them that suffer from various mental health concerns, especially post-COVID, right? It's become more and more of an issue themselves, their children, their families, their friends. And so, you know, having policies that set forth what options there are will also help employers to know what their obligations are. Because again, you need to have a policy, you need to follow the policy. And so that ties to what types of proactive programs you might have, what types of accommodations might be available to people if they understand that if they come forward and explain that, it was, Joe, you mentioned earlier the question about what's protected. Alcoholism is a protected disability, and so is addiction. Addiction is a disability under the law. Again, it's different if you're currently using an illegal drug, but the addiction part is protected. And so people have, even if it's long-term, ongoing accommodation needs, there's options out there. So the companies need to understand what their obligations are to provide, or at least have conversations about how to deal with accommodation requests, and to recognize when someone's asking for help. Because, with us, and it's not, with employment law and with employers, it's not just, someone doesn't have to say, I need an accommodation under the ADA, right? You don't need to use those words. You need to say, I need help. And if that needs to be recognized by HR or whoever the issue is being raised to as a request for an accommodation, and because that is going to invoke the company's legal obligation to engage in that interactive process. So having all of those things set out clearly for the employers to follow and for the employees to know where to go, because that also ties to, Joe, your comment about, well, what if the middle manager gets the comment? Middle managers still need to be aware, but if your policy says this is who you go to, it helps to somewhat narrow the liability for an employer if the person's not following the policy. Because if you've given the policy and you've said, if you need help, you need to go to either HR or your manager, and then they go to someone else, it helps the employer a little bit in the event that there's an issue and if they haven't followed through on their end. So, this is totally somewhere where the prevention is worth the pound of cure, because the policies and the training will go a long way for employers.
And it's important as a follow-up is that if your company is mid-sized, okay, and you haven't addressed this with a lawyer, it might be time to lawyer up, as we might say, okay? Because this is a considerable legal issue. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've just mentioned, even in the last 45 minutes, like multiple levels of legal concerns that stem from this type of issue, whether it's discrimination, retaliation, failure to accommodate, potential negligence issues. There's so many factors. And unfortunately, right now, and I think Chris and Aoife can speak to this better than I can, the substance abuse issue or substance use issue, alcoholism, mental health concerns, these things are continuing to grow at this point. And so these are issues that if a company hasn't faced it yet, they likely will. And so being prepared is the best thing that companies can do.
We talk about people operating forklifts. We know about bus drivers or people who operate company vehicles. My people operate typewriters. Okay, and the legacy of a typewriter, of a keyboard. There's danger with those too, is there not?
Totally.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is like their communication with your key, funder and all of that, like the relationship management piece suffers. So yeah, behind a desk or out in the field, it doesn't really matter, and it's also about team morale.
I think, it's important, and I agree with the other panelists for sure. I think it's important to not use a single lens to address the issue, right? There are legal concerns and risks. There are financial investments and fiscal realities for a business, and for the nature of the issue. There's the human side and the personal side of caring for individuals and offering competent care, and being prepared, being proactive, educating accordingly, having those policies, and then accessing resources that are appropriate for that individual. If you put that together, I think it's a really important way to address the issue adequately.
I want to just mention this as the last question. I want you all to summarize what based on this. Okay, people are dying out there because of this disease, this problem that we have, and it's not just a matter of what you might read in newspapers and hear on TV and et cetera about the fentanyl problem, which is one aspect of some of the problems, but people die all the time from alcoholism and drug addiction. And I want you, just from a human standpoint, to say, why employers need to care, and why they need to act, and how you guys can help them. I'm going to start with Kim.
Well, from the employer perspective and from an employment law perspective, I mean, we can help you to create policies. We can help you to be in touch with people like IFA who can help when you have trouble. And we can be there to support from, again, a legal perspective on the day-to-day issues when these things come up and people panic, like, oh, this, Henry just came to work and he's falling asleep, or he's, sent out crazy emails to people, or whatever the case may be. We can help to deal with that in a real life, real time situation to help the person, help the company, and hopefully come to a positive resolution to the situation, which may be an ongoing thing. It may not be a one-time resolution, but we can help people to navigate these situations productively for both the company and the employee.
And Aoife?
Joe, yeah, the biggest message is substance misuse, abuse, and dependence doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter how much money you make. It doesn't matter the color of your skin. It doesn't matter your gender, your religion. That's the human side of this. It affects everybody from all levels. And often people have a stereotype or a stigma, a kind of a negative perceptions to who would fall prey to it, and are quite surprised. Maybe their CEO is, the high performing pill popper person, you know what I mean? And struggling. So all levels, executives are vulnerable. Your entry level people are vulnerable. It doesn't matter. So it's really important from a workplace culture perspective as well, that we're reaching out, we're connecting, we're supporting, we're educating, we're helping. If we're just hiring and firing, that's not the great employer of today, bottom line. So a great employer of today is tuned into the reality of life, the reality of what it means to have great human beings show up. And we are in a great position as employers to be massively influential in people's lives in a great way.
And Chris, please, the last word before we close.
Yeah, great. Well, you said people are dying. I would first of all have to say I absolutely agree. Some people die very quickly from very powerful substances like fentanyl, which is an opioid painkiller. And other people die more slowly in silence and over a longer period of time from alcohol or alcohol-related illnesses. You might show up at the hospital or to your physician with renal failure, liver failure, or different things, but it's very deeply connected to the use of alcohol or some other substance. So I would say that is certainly the case, and more than ever, that is happening. More people are dying statistically. But I would close, or I would just end by saying you don't have to. It's a treatable illness. There are resources available. As the other panelists here have expressed, there are wonderful opportunities to get in front of this, have policies, provide education, be situated and positioned as an employer to be supportive, and have resources like IFA and others represent to really help and make a difference. Certainly in the business I'm in here, but in most organizations, I mean, the success of the organization of the business is really built. It's built on the quality of the people. So there is a social and ethical, I think, requirement of being human. But if we want to be successful in business, I mean, it's having individuals, employees who embrace our values, are able to show up for work, do meaningful work that derives a benefit for them, their families, and for the organizations and businesses that we represent. So it's a good thing to do at every level, and treatment, hope, recovery is definitely very, very possible.
These have been insightful and powerful responses to some really big issues that are confronting us. This has been an unbelievable hour. At this point, Chris, Kim, and Aoife, I would like to kick it back to my colleague, Associate Publisher Jenna Natali.
Thanks, Joe. And, I think just to wrap it up, this is something that we're all seeing somewhere, unfortunately. And I think that we've all touched upon that. But it is comforting for me as a Long Islander to know that there's organizations right here on Long Island and professionals that are so dedicated to figuring this out. So I just want to thank once again our amazing panelists, Dr. Christopher Yadrin from Wellbridge, Kim Malerba from Ruskin Moscow Faltashek, and Aoife O'Donnell, of course, the CEO of National EAP, for joining LIBN today, just to really uncover for, employees, anybody who tuned in today to watch this, to see, how this could apply to their lives and, what kind of resources and first steps should be. And thanks once again to Wellbridge and to Ruskin Moscow Faltashek for bringing this conversation to the forefront of the community. Keep an eye out because there's going to be some more stuff coming out from our co-sponsors shortly with more resources and information about this topic in the coming weeks. So if you like this episode of LIBN Now, definitely head on over to libn.com/LIBNOW to view past episodes, to watch this episode recording, and to register for future episodes. And thanks again for joining us today, and we'll see you all at the next Experts Forum.